Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Jordan Hayes, and I'm the primary presenter for this talk. We're going to be talking about modern authentication with SQL. And I also have here Peter, my coworker.
Hi, everybody.
And he's going to be kicking off
Yeah,
the session.
I'll just do the introduction, and then Jordan, she will take over, and she will do the rest. So we're both of the security team at Microsoft, so we work on security features, and Jordan is mainly the PM on Entra, what we're going to talk about today. All right. Am I audible? Everybody can hear me? Yeah? Okay, perfect. Let's go. Cool. So what's on the agenda for today? I'm just going to talk a little bit about passwords, and then Jordan, like I said, is going to take over. He's going to explain you about Microsoft Entra ID, how it works, how you can use it in SQL, and why you should use Microsoft Entra IDs, right? So to get started, I don't know if you noticed, but Microsoft has been hacked like a couple of months ago by Russian hackers. And the reason because of that is that we had a test system that was just only using passwords, so we didn't have any two-factor authentication. And that was actually the reason why some of our corporate systems got exposed. So passwords are not always as good as it should be, right? So what we did because of this incident, we start introducing what we call the Microsoft Secure Future Initiative. So basically, internally, we're trying to get rid of all the passwords inside our company. Yeah. Now, of course, I assume that everybody still uses passwords, right? So passwords, yeah, they're the most common form of authentication, but also the weakest one, right? So they're insecure. They're often reused. I do it myself. So if you have like lots of websites, I always use the same type of passwords. It can be easily stolen, and it's guessable. And just to give you a funny example, there we go. I'll try a little bit louder. So one of my Tinder dates, she was at my home, and she opened her laptop, and I was just joking at her. I was saying, "Hey, your password is probably QWERTY01," and she was like, "Oh yeah, how do you know my password?" So it was that, yeah, she was, or her password was that easy, and that's yeah, not strong at all and guessable, yeah. And last but not least, passwords, it's hard to manage, right? So if you use SQL authentication and you're the DBA, how should you manage all these passwords, right, inside SQL? So it's also really, really hard to do. Now, what we're also doing internally at Microsoft, when we release new features and new products, we always do what we call an internal threat model. So we did the last, I think, around 400 we did. And the first thing that we always check is, where do you keep your passwords? Where do you keep your credentials, right? And if we're flagging Microsoft Entra, then we're good to go. If we're flagging, hey, we're using passwords, yeah, then red alerts coming up. So these are passwords. Now, how can you, or how do you know that your data are exposed to vulnerability and that they are still using passwords? Well, we introduced something new in Microsoft Defender. It's called Defender for Cloud, the data security. And we're actually, what we're doing there is threat protection. So we're showing you in a nice dashboard which currently the threats are ongoing. And on top of that, we're also doing vulnerability assessment. So this is something new, which is currently in public preview. I'll just quickly go over a couple of screenshots to show you how it actually works. Let me quickly go for my pointer here. So this is a screenshot of the portal. So you go to Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and then you go here to the data security part. And then you have here the severity attacks paths. So an attacks path represents, a chain of misconfigurations in your environment that an attacker could exploit and gain access to your data or your compute. So if you drill down to these attacks paths, then it will actually show you a list of all the attacks that are currently ongoing, let's say, on your environment. Now, if we drill one down once more, then you can actually see those paths. And for example, this database has an open internet connection, and on top of that, your database is actually using SQL authentication. So this is really a threat for your data in general, right? Now, what this also do, this Defender, it gives you suggestions like, hey, instead of using SQL authentication, you should use, yeah, here in this case, it still indicates Active Directory, but it should be changed to Entra ID. And on top of that, yeah, it also recommends like, hey, the public network should be disabled as well. One last thing that I wanted to show about this is, yeah, the real threats that are ongoing. So you get security alerts, like here in this case, they're suspecting a brute force attack. So these are all new in the Microsoft Defender for cloud related to data security. Okay? Now, if the passwords are bad, what's the alternative? And that is what Jordan is going to tell you.
Thank you, Peter.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so what Peter showed through Defender for Cloud was some of the motivations that you can see through those capabilities for why you want to be disabling your passwords. And if passwords are bad, what is the alternative? Microsoft Entra ID, or the IAM formerly known as AAD, Azure Active Directory. I didn't do the rename. Don't blame me for it. I had to do all the updates, same as I've heard a lot of customers say to me. But this Microsoft Entra ID is an identity and access management solution. So we'll go through what that means and how the fundamentals of Microsoft Entra ID works, and then we'll talk about how they work inside of SQL. I can.
It's distracting, isn't it?
Just a bit. It's okay. So, Microsoft Entra ID is, as I mentioned, an identity and access management solution. So what does that mean? There's a lot of things that come with it, including identity management and federation, authentication and authorization, access control, and reporting and monitoring. It ensures that the right people, machines, and software components get access to the right resources at the right time. It handles the provisioning and deprovisioning of users. It's all integrated in a single platform that you can use across your entire data estate. So, identities are the core basic concepts that everything in an identity and access management solution runs off of. So you have different types of identities for different purposes. We have machine identities and also human identities. The machine identities represent your workloads or your devices. So workloads can be things that are like running inside of Azure. So containers, virtual machines, applications, and services. And device identities are the identities of the devices you use to connect with. So device identities we won't touch on too much, a little bit later. And then there are also the human identities. So these are the identities that represent the actual users, the actual humans connecting to your resources. Now, the way that these identities are managed inside of Entra is something called service principals, well, for workload identities. These are the security objects that are used to authenticate and authorize your workloads to access resources in Azure, or access the identities of the Azure resources themselves. They define the access policies and permissions for these Azure resources. When you have an application that's registered in a tenant, it's assigned a service principal along with an application object. And we'll touch on applications in a minute. There's also a concept called managed identities, which we'll also touch on in more depth. So with app registrations, these are the trust relationship between the Microsoft Identity Platform and your application. So it's when you create a resource or create an application, you can then register it in Entra, and that creates the trust relationship. There's two objects associated with an app registration in Entra. There's the application object and the service principal object. So the application object is the definition of like the resource or the app itself, whereas the service principal is the security context of the resource. So it defines the access policies, as I mentioned earlier. App registrations have two forms of authentication available. Client secrets, which unfortunately are also just passwords, application passwords, and certificates. Now, when you are using a certificate to authenticate to an application, you have to manage that certificate on your own. You can store it in an Azure Key Vault, which is great, but you have to manage the rotation of that certificate, and there's still overhead there on you to be managing these resources. And this is another area where organizations are prone to failures or gaps. And I have another example from Microsoft, unfortunately, where expired SSL certificates caused an outage in Azure. So this is, I think, a couple years ago. But it just goes to show that like certificates, while they are better than passwords, they are still challenging to manage. And there are many certificates in large enterprise applications. And it just takes one certificate to expire to cause outages like this. So what can we do about this? What's better than app registrations, certificates, client secrets? Managed identities. So managed identities are a special form of service principal. They remove the need for developers to manage the security credentials themselves. And it allows you to authenticate to resources securely within the Microsoft Identity Platform without having to embed credentials within your code or maintain them outside of your code. So the Entra Identity Platform itself handles the credential rotation on your behalf, and it's certificate-based authentication, but you don't have to be managing those certificates. There are two kinds of managed identities. There are system-assigned and user-assigned, and this gets a little bit into the technical details. System-assigned managed identities are assigned to an individual resource. They are the lifecycle and the security boundary of the system-assigned managed identity is the resource that it is tied to. So when you have a system-assigned managed identity, if on a resource, if that resource is deleted, then the identity goes with it. User-assigned managed identities are their own individual resource, and they can have a many-to-many relationship with Azure resources. So an example of a scenario where using user-assigned managed identities would be helpful is if, say, you have a distributed infrastructure where you have like the same service running on multiple nodes across multiple regions, but the access that you want them to have to a resource is the same. Say you want some like background daemon to be connecting to SQL and only doing writes. You can assign that a single user-assigned managed identity to all of those resources, and then they will all have the same access, and you don't have to be individually managing that access. It abstracts the management from the individual resource to the managed identity. And then it also acts, as I mentioned, as its own individual Azure resource. There's not, it's not, the lifecycle of the identity is managed by you. So We also have users, user identities. Users are the humans within your organization or within your directory that you want to be able to connect to resources. There's also additional capabilities like B2B collaboration, which lets you invite users from other organizations or from other like email providers to access your resources within your organization. There's also Microsoft Entra Connect, which enables you to federate your on-premises AD, Active Directory infrastructure, to Azure. Now, with the Entra platform, it supports modern OAuth 2.0 authorization flows, including username and password. You can use Windows authentication when in a federated environment where your on-premises AD is federated through Entra. You can also have interactive user prompts for authentication and device code flow, as well as many other authentication methods. So touching on passwords for authentication a little bit, or the different options available within Entra. All of these options are configurable within the tenant. So you can, it shows the range of authentication options available. So if you need passwords, if you really need passwords, you can have passwords. But you can also disable passwords entirely from within your tenant. You can say everyone in your tenant needs to use multi-factor authentication to be able to connect to any resources or to specific resources, or designate certain users to require multi-factor authentication. And these are the options available. So Authenticator, push notifications, SMS, phone sign-in, Windows Hello, all of these rich authentication options that provide much more security than basic username and password. So this is the overview that I have for Entra ID, and now we're going to talk about how Entra authentication works within SQL.
Questions?
Oh, yeah. Any questions before we move on? No. Okay. So how does Entra authentication actually work within SQL? This shows the requirements for each Azure SQL product. The requirements are the same a little bit, but then vary when we get to VMs and also SQL Server on premises. So SQL Server 2022 is the first version of on-prem to introduce support for Microsoft Entra authentication. And that requires registering the machine that's hosting your instance with Azure Arc. So are you familiar with Arc? Is everyone familiar with Arc? Okay. We also try to make it easy for you to set up Entra authentication. So the only thing that's really required is creating the administrator. Once the administrator has been enabled, Entra authentication is enabled for your SQL instance. I also have a note here about granting your server access to Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph is the API service for permissions within Entra ID. And for certain operations in SQL DB, it's required to assign some permissions there for the SQL instance to be able to query MS Graph for things like looking up users, user objects, user IDs, object IDs for applications, and group IDs. For Azure SQL Managed Instance, the permissions to query MS Graph are a requirement. in SQL Server and Azure VMs, there's an abstraction where you don't actually assign the permissions on the SQL instance, but on the VM itself, and that passes through to the SQL instance. Yeah. So what does this actually look like? So in this diagram, I have an application that is using Microsoft Data SQL Client to connect. The client makes a call to the Microsoft Entra Identity platform to get a token. The identity platform itself performs the authentication of the user or the identity, and then returns the token back to the client. The client is then able to authorize a connection to SQL using that token. So all authentication with Entra is token-based. Excuse me. Yeah. So how does this look for managed identities? This is a similar graph to diagram to what I just had, but there's more pieces in play. So we have an Azure host with an Azure VM running on it and an application inside of that VM. Now, the managed identity itself is actually assigned on the VM. It's tied directly to the virtual machine that you're running the application on. So when your application makes a call to SQL connection.open, the same flow through the Microsoft Data SQL client happens, and the VM makes a call to the Azure Instance Metadata Service to request that token. The Instance Metadata Service then forwards the call to the Entra platform to request the service principal credentials. And the platform then performs the authentication and returns the token. The token is then passed through from the metadata service back to the Data SQL client, and then the connection is made to SQL. I also have an example of the connection string, what this looks like for managed identities. So you'll see here, you might notice that there's no name of any identity. There's no passwords. It's just that the authentication type is Active Directory managed identity. This is like an example of a system-assigned managed identity connection, where you don't even need to specify the credentials of the system-assigned managed identity. It knows, like the identity platform knows what identity is being used on the VM. So we've talked a lot at this point about Entra and the identity platform, but we haven't actually talked much about SQL yet. So I wanted to tie together what the SQL security principles are, give a bit of an overview of that, and then show how these different identities that I've talked about in Entra hook into SQL. So we have here a SQL instance with a master DB and user databases. And you can see logins. Logins are server principals. So they're the identities on the master database. They can be assigned to server roles and permissions. And then within a user database, we have users, which are database principals, also known as database principals. And we can have either login-based users, so users created from a login in master, or we can have contained database users. Contained database users don't have any association to the server login, and it's scoped, like the user's connection is scoped to the singular database that it is contained. It's been created in. And besides connections to other databases, login-based users and contained database users operate pretty much the same. They can also both be assigned database roles and also application roles. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that they operate pretty much the same. There are differences because server level permissions are passed that are assigned to logins are passed down to the user based, the login based users in a user DP as well. So how does Entra fit into this? Pretty simply, Microsoft Entra users, applications, and groups can be created as logins or as contained database users in SQL. So I should mention that logins are in public preview currently for Azure SQL Database. They are generally available for managed instance, for VMs, and for SQL Server 2022. So the terminology, there's some overlap here, and that becomes a point of friction a lot in like trying to understand this. It's something that we've been working on a lot to try and clarify, especially in our documentation. So we're trying to make that a little bit clearer because we have principles, we have Entra principles, service principles, application principles, user principles, server principles, database principles, users in Entra, users in SQL, logins in SQL, logins as a concept of just logins. So that was the motivation for kind of stepping through all of this information at a time to lay the foundation for how this works. Any questions at this point? Do we have a mic? Or there's a question over there.
Or just shout.
Or just shout. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Come over here.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So the question was, can you have multiple managed identities on a VM? So I'm actually going to show a little bit of this in a demo that I have coming up, but you can. You can only have one system assigned managed identity on a VM, but you can have as many user assigned managed identities as you'd like. On a VM, you can also individually assign them to your SQL resources. So we've talked a lot about authenticating to SQL, but managed identities can also be used for SQL to make connections to other Azure resources. So the managed identities in Azure can also be assigned to your SQL resources for outbound connections. Any other questions? Yeah. Right. So the question was, are we planning to backport support for Entra identities to SQL 2019, 2017, to prior versions of SQL on-prem? I don't believe we have plans at this time to do that, but we would love to get that feedback if that's something that would be really helpful or would encourage people to use the feature more. So yeah, if you have that feedback, I have a slide later to where you can make these suggestions. We'd really appreciate any feedback y'all have. Any other questions? Great. So, I've said that you can create all these identities, but how do you actually do it? Well, it's really simple. It's pretty much the same as creating logins and users for non-Entra principles. There's a small variance in the syntax, in the T-SQL syntax, where you say from external provider. And the only external provider that we support is Microsoft Entra ID, so there is no need to specify. That's the entire statement to create a login or create a user. I also note here that these can be users, groups, or applications. So the syntax is also the same across all of those different identity types. You only have to specify like the display name of the identity in Entra or the name of the group or application. And then creating users, similarly simple. In order to create specifically login-based users, you have to specify from login and then the name of the login. And for creating contained database users, it's just from external provider again. So I have a demo to show a little bit how some of this works. For enabling Microsoft Entra authentication in SQL database, we'll go through a few different things, how to set the Entra administrator for a server to a group, verify that those group members can connect to the server, and then show how to connect using managed identities, and then also enforcing Entra-only authentication for the server and showing how that works, what that looks like. So here I have the Azure portal. I have a SQL Server instance on my Contoso internal environment. And I'm going to go to Microsoft Entra ID. And you'll see that there's the Entra admin. As I've mentioned, the only step to enable Entra authentication on an existing server is to set that admin. So I'll search for this group that I've created called Contoso admins. This group has 2 service principals in it. So groups can contain both service principals and users. They're really effective for managing your access. So you can create a group in your SQL instance, and then all the users in that group can be added. So it's a way of like abstracting out of SQL your access management. So it pulls the management to Entra ID, where you can then also delegate management to all your other resources at the same time. So in this group, I have a user-assigned managed identity and also the virtual machine that I'm going to use to connect. So I'm going to add that group. As the Entra admin. And then I'll go over to the VM that I've created. So this VM I'm using just as a way to connect to the SQL instance. This isn't a SQL virtual machine. It's just a virtual machine. And this is helpful for primarily like testing your connections using managed identities, because there aren't managed identities are typically for non-user connections. This is a way of doing it through SQL Server Management Studio. So I have my SQL Server Management Studio open on my virtual machine. And I'm going to connect to the database using managed identity. Now, the cool thing about this is, again, I'm going to be using the system assigned managed identity of the VM to connect. So I don't even have to specify the identity name here. I can just say use Microsoft Entra managed identity, and I'm able to connect. So the connection is made between the VM itself and the SQL instance. It's also, I should mention, instant. That I created the group, I added it as a server admin, and I was immediately able to connect. Now I also have a user assigned managed identity. For the user assigned managed identity, in order for it to connect, it's pretty much the same process, except that you need to specify the client ID of the managed identity. So here I have the managed identity. This also kind of shows that it's its own individual resource, whereas the system assigned managed identity on the VM, there's no other resource that I can like go to. That's a separate resource here. So I'm going to add the user assigned managed identity to the VM. Okay. And then use that client ID when I'm making my connection to SQL. So nothing changes as far as the authentication mode in SSMS. All I'm doing is now specifying the client ID of the user assigned managed identity. And just like that, I'm able to connect. Any questions about this so far? Cool. So now I'm going to go back to, oh, yeah. So the question was if you can use an Active Directory group, or it has to be within Azure. So for Azure SQL Database well, recently with Managed Instance, we added support for Active Directory direct connections. But if you want to use Active Directory, it has to be through federation with Microsoft Entra ID. So when you federate your directory, it creates a reference in Microsoft Entra to your identities in AD. And then your Active Directory is still the service that's used to authenticate. So the identity platform reroutes the call to your Active Directory on-prem and then retrieves a token that way. But it returns a Microsoft Entra token. So you're still using Entra authentication, just like federated through, AD federated through Entra ID. So it is possible, as the short answer. So the way that this server is configured currently is for both SQL authentication and Entra authentication. So I've got a password, a username and password that I can currently use to connect. And I'll show that here. So not Windows authentication, SQL Server authentication. The login is boot passwords. And I have, so I have my connection. So I'm still able to connect using the SQL Server admin on the SQL instance. But if I want to completely get rid of passwords, that's you have to get rid of SA. SA is the root of all evil. It is the root administrator, and it's all backed secured, or it's all secured with just a simple password. So we can disable SA by requiring Entra authentication, Entra only authentication, and then we can go back and try to connect using SA and see that it failed. And the error message is that Azure Active Directory only authentication is enabled. So immediately, passwords disabled. So I've shown what it looks like as a user. How do you connect to SQL with Entra ID, specifically with managed identities? But how do you do it programmatically? These are what the connection strings look like for the different authentication methods. And you'll see that in none of these modes, there's any passwords specified, especially with managed identities. I was also asked to include a PSA here from my coworker Michael that you should be configuring TLS on the server. You shouldn't be specifying it through the connection string itself, but have it here as a good practice. So this shows connecting with managed identities, with interactive user flows, with integrated Windows authentication, and also with a default authentication method. And default is an interesting recent addition to authentication options with Entra that will scan your the caches on your machine to in various places to see if you have a security token available to use that's associated to you. There are some requirements in order to use managed identity authentication with SQL. So Microsoft Data SQL Client is a requirement. JDBC, ODBC, OLADB, all these drivers have minimum versions. These are listed here in order to use these authentication methods. So we've talked about like how to connect, but there's a lot more that Entra unlocks than just connections. And so we're going to talk about manageability with Microsoft Entra ID. There's functionality called conditional access, Entra only auth, which we've already mentioned, and also single sign-on. These are, as I've mentioned, just a few of the options or the capabilities with Entra. Let's go through them. So with conditional access, these are policies that enable you to apply additional authentication methods or to require additional authentication methods like multi-factor authentication or restrict access based on location or device. This makes it a lot easier to manage your access requirements for all your Azure SQL resources in one single place. So I have a slide showing what the conditional access view looks like in the portal. It enables central enforcement, and it applies to all user authentication methods. So the second that you say MFA is required, it's required regardless of the way that the user is connecting. I was going to show also in the portal what this looks like. So this is the conditional access view. We can take a look at our policies. And you can say MFA required. If we create a new conditional access policy, can show a little bit of what this looks like. So can say for all users, for example, targeting all cloud apps. So again, this is abstracting the requirements of managing individually your SQL resources and makes it so that you're managing your entire data estate, your entire infrastructure at once. But you can also specify specific particular apps. So by selecting Azure SQL Database, this is the first-party application that is used for all connections to SQL. So with this one policy, you can require multi-factor authentication for all of your Azure SQL resources, every single one, in one place. You can also have other, you can do other requirements here too. It's not just for multi-factor authentication. If you're in a hybrid joined environment, you can require that a device a user is using to connect to SQL or to your resources is specifically hybrid joined. You can require a device to be marked as compliant through a variety of compliance requirements that you can also set elsewhere. You can require password changes. You can require all of these different capabilities that secure your user connections. You can also enable it only as a report or enable it to require it. So now this policy, you can also view connections used. I won't go further into detail about conditional access policies, but these are some of the capabilities. Um, as I showed earlier, you can also require Microsoft Entra only authentication, which disables all SQL authentication, including SA. And this is enforceable as well via Azure policy, which is another type of policy. So with Azure policies, you can require that SQL resources are deployed or use only Entra authentication. And then we have seamless single sign-on with Entra Connect. So single sign-on reduces the need for multiple passwords. Users are automatically signed in both on-premises and cloud-based applications. And it's available with either password hash synchronization or pass-through authentication, which are two methods that Entra Connect uses to connect your on-premises passwords to Entra. So pass-through authentication is what I was describing earlier, where Entra makes the call back into your Active Directory to authenticate. And the amazing thing about about seamless single sign-on with Entra ID is that there are no components needed on premises in order to get this working. There's a small agent that needs to be installed, but that's the only requirements. So yeah. I mentioned earlier also device identities. This is where one of the places where device identities comes into play with single sign-on. So with single sign-on, the device that's used to connect is part of the authorization flow and is what's used for single sign-on to work. So any questions at this point? Yes, so all of so the question was, can user-assigned managed identities be audited? Can you see what, can you configure managed identities for only certain types of access to SQL? Yes, once you're inside of SQL, once these principles have been created in SQL, they operate the same in terms of permission, access, and delegation as any other type of user in SQL. So I ran a little bit over. The Basically, this is just an overview of what we've talked about today, why it's all worth it. Entra ID provides a modern, centralized, unified identity platform. Passwordless authentication with managed identities eliminates the risk of credential exposure and it simplifies the developer experience. You can secure user connections with multi-factor authentication and single sign-on, and you simplify the access and authorization management to your entire SQL fleet and Azure resources all in one. So, thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, we're over now, but you can feel free to come up and talk to me afterward. Here are here are the feedback links. So if you have feedback that you'd like to post publicly on the Azure Ideas forums, that's available. And then you can also email our team at SQLAADfeedback@microsoft.com. So thank you.